Good evening. I'm Donna Wares, editor of the LA Times Book Club. Tonight's guest is indie bookstore owner and best-selling author Ann Patchett, the best-selling author of 7 novels, including Bel Canto and The Dutch House. Her new book is These Precious Days. It's a collection of personal essays about friendship, family, writing, and so much more that came together during the pandemic and tapped into her recurring thoughts about death. She explains the backstory of the book this way. According to my small, unscientific study, writers who were already deep into a project when the pandemic hit were going to be okay going forward, while those of us who had yet to start or had barely started froze in our tracks. She concluded, the year 2020 didn't seem like a great time to start a family or a business or a novel. Then she found her loophole. Death, it seems, had no interest in essays, so she assembled a collection about the people and subjects most dear to her in these precious days. This evening, Ann Patchett will be in conversation with my colleague, columnist Steve Lopez. And now, please join me in welcoming them both to LA Times Book Club's virtual stage. Welcome. Hi, Ann. How's it going in Nashville?
Things are great. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're delighted to welcome you to our community book club. And Steve, of course, hasn't been with us for a while, but he joined us for our very first book club night back in 2019 with Susan Orlean. So, hi, Steve. How's it going?
Well, it's going just fine, and I'm what a pleasure to virtually meet Ann Patchett. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I am thrilled to have you both here, and so are our readers. We have had an enormous sign up of readers coming in to join us this evening, and the questions have been pouring in as well. So before we start our conversation, I just wanted to mention we'll be live tweeting the event tonight, and if anyone has questions they'd like to share for our guests, please share them at latimes.com. And now I'm going to step away for a bit. I'd like to turn the conversation over to Steve, and I'll rejoin you both a little later.
Thank you, Donna. Ann, I want to say, first of all, you have a much better background than I do. I've got to work on my background.
This background has become the most important thing that I own during Zoom. It's an old screen that's been in the breakfast room for 20 years. And now it is the thing that everyone knows me by.
Well, it looks great. Now, this wonderful book of yours travels far and wide. It visits every human emotion. And there are stops in Los Angeles, in Paris, in New York, in Alaska. And by the way, Ann, I got airsick when your husband, Carl, took control of that float plane and kept thudding it down on the lake, landing and taking off. I'm not sure I would have made it through that trip in one piece. I do think, though, that I'd like to start in Nashville, where you are now, where you live, and where you own and operate an independent bookstore that is, by your description, filled with readers and with authors and neighborhood dogs. And I found the description of what goes on in that store just so captivating. And I just loved how you explained what it means to you and puts you in touch with your audience and with stories. Did you know when you started that venture that it would be as successful as it has been?
I didn't know anything. I was introduced to Karen Hayes, who is my partner at the store, on April 30th, 2011. And we opened the store on November 15th. There she is. There's Karen, 2011. So we were two strangers, basically, who were interested in opening a bookstore. And I had worked in a bookstore. Karen had worked in publishing. We had both spent our lives in bookstores, but we really didn't know how to run one. And we just hit the ground running. And I didn't have any idea about what was going to happen, what we were going to be doing, but it worked. And it's funny, tonight, we had what we call the Dog and Pony Show at the store, which is a holiday event that we do every year about 5 of us on the staff have an after hours program, and people buy a $5 ticket, which you can then put towards the purchase of a book. And we all stand up and do our book recommendations for the year. And then I left early and ran home, and now here I am. So I'm feeling very connected to the bookstore right this minute.
Well, I wish I could have been there to see that. There's one little vignette in your book that I found particularly intriguing. A couple comes in, and they've got a daughter who hasn't really taken to reading as much
Yeah.
as they would like, and you said to them, bring her to the store, have her lie down on a dirty dog blanket and read to one of the hounds in here.
Yes.
And she did that. She did that. How did you know that that might work?
You know, it's really funny. I don't have children. And before I opened the bookstore, I didn't know a thing about children's literature or about how children read, but I just saw it over and over again. Children who aren't confident readers feel really confident reading to dogs. Also, I told that, there they are, there's Marley and Lavinia. I also told that couple that they should be lowering the bar. So they were trying to get her to read The Secret Garden and Anne of Green Gables and beautiful, beautiful books that they had grown up reading. I said, get her to read Captain Underpants and Diary of a Wimpy Kid, books that a lot of people feel are very irreverent, but kids really love them. And they feel a lot more comfortable often reading those books. So start low, start with a dog, start with the Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and that's how you build your readers.
Those two books never fail with kids, do they? Captain
No,
Underpants and Diary of a
no,
Wimpy Kid.
no. And I
There's a
always say
formula
it's a
there.
gateway drug. You know, if you don't read anything, you won't read anything. But if you read something that grown-ups might consider to be, you know, not a great book, then you will go on and read better books.
And like you, I've lived in different places. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, but lived on the East Coast for a while. When I lived in downtown Philadelphia, there was a little independent bookstore called Joseph Fox. And I was a tiny, tiny little place. You know, maybe, I don't know, 400 or 500 square feet.
Oh,
And you had
wow.
to go down this staircase to get there. It was below street level. It was kind of hard to spot. And then Borders opens around the street. And I thought, oh no, there goes Joseph Fox. And then within the same 1 block radius, Barnes and Noble opened a gigantic store. And I thought that's got to be the end of Joseph Fox. Well, today, Borders is gone, Barnes and Noble is still there, but so is Joseph Fox. And I think that you have a bookstore opening very near you. And was it an Amazon bricks and mortar? And
Yeah,
has
yeah.
has that happened? And what is the secret to small independent bookstores? What can they offer that the giants can't?
Curation, that would be where I would start. You know how if you go to your favorite little Italian joint and there are 6 things on the menu and they are so thoughtfully prepared and they're specific to the restaurant, you love them, the menu changes all the time. And then the next night you go to the Cheesecake Factory and they hand you something that looks like the Los Angeles Yellow Pages, and you have to figure out what you're going to have for dinner. And by the time you get to the end of the menu, you feel sort of sick. So that's part of why a little bookstore works. It's curation. Somebody has gone through and picked the books that they think that their customers are really going to relate to. And a lot of it is just service, the staff. If you have a little store, you're hiring people who are readers and who really know the customers. They remember what the customer read the last time, what they liked. Our manager at Parnassus is a guy named Andy Brennan, and he had been a manager at Borders before he came to us. And he said at the end of the Borders days, the word from corporate was, if somebody comes in and applies for a job and they say they're a reader, don't hire them, because readers are introverts and we want to hire extroverts. That's the quickest way to kill a bookstore.
Um, and did Amazon open near you?
they're right across the street in the mall. But the
Um,
thing, and that's actually not a problem, weirdly. If you want to buy a book from Amazon, you're not going to go to the mall to buy a book from Amazon. You're going to, you're going to order it online. And the thing that's so fascinating to me, if you order my book from Amazon, it's discounted. If you come into my store, Parnassus, and you buy my new book, I think it's $28 or $27. If you go into the Amazon store in the mall, it's the exact same price. It's $28. If you order it from Amazon online, it's probably $21. So why is that? How is that possible? That you could order it at a big discount in your house, but have to pay full price if you go into the Amazon store. It's because all they want at the Amazon store is your information. They want you to sign up for Amazon Prime. And once you sign up for Amazon Prime, you will get the discount. And in return, you will give them your home address, your phone number, your credit card information, and they will sell that information. They make their money by selling you as a unit, as a customer. And we don't do that. Plus,
well,
we have
so yeah,
dogs and we have story time and we have relationships. We have
and
community.
you have a published author that maybe that helps a little. Maybe that's a
There's
draw
that too, right?
as well. With Amazon, it's kind of a deal with the devil. So let me move on. One reason that I so enjoyed reading this collection was that the news can be. I'm in the news business, and I've got to admit that the news can be a little bit depressing at times. It was just a nice escape to read yet another essay, and the range of topics is just so wonderful in your book. I wondered, though, that here we are in this frighteningly polarized time in this nation. And you've managed to write a book that it's delightfully nonpartisan and somewhat apolitical. Did you set out to do that? Did you think that we needed a break from what's on the 11 o'clock news and the front page of the newspaper? And are we in media focused too much on that? You find wonderful stories that are as universal and enlightening as anything that is on the news. Did you think about that when you gathered this collection of essays and topics?
Oh, I didn't. I was writing about the things that were in my house and the things that I care about. I consider myself to be political, but I also am a bit of a dinosaur. Oh, not a bit of a dinosaur. I'm actually just a dinosaur. I am not on any form of social media. I don't watch television at all, and I don't use a cell phone. I get the New York Times delivered to my house every day, and I read it on paper. So I consider myself to be informed, but I also don't consider myself to be obsessed. And I do think that there is a lot more going on in life than what's going on in the paper. The other thing is, I'm one writer, I'm one voice, I'm a tile in a giant mosaic. And so I don't feel in any way a need to cover all topics. Idana said in your introduction that you had done the first interview in the series with one of my very favorite authors, Susan Orlean. And Susan has a new book of essays that just came out called On Animals, which is fantastic. That was one of the books that I was recommending tonight at the Dog and Pony Show. I love that book. But you wouldn't say to Susan Orlean, why isn't this book more political? Although weirdly, she's taken some heat for the fact that she doesn't talk more about animal rights and that kind of thing. I'm writing a book about the things that happened in my home and in my life. Susan's writing a book about animals. It doesn't mean that we're not political. It doesn't mean that we don't care about what's going on in the world. It just isn't that book.
Having lived in California, in New York, in Paris, and in the South, have you ever thought, might that be in your future, a book of political essays told around people?
No, I don't think so, because I guess I know a lot of people in that business, and I just think that they are so infinitely more informed on topics than I am. It I don't know that I'm the person to give voice to that unless it was some sort of extremely middle America, we want to know. There are some things I certainly have written about guns, um, some more political things that I write about. I write about choice and women's rights. We have a wonderful, wonderful writer here in Nashville named Margaret Rankle, who writes op-eds for the Times, and she's a very close friend of mine. And I see what she goes through every week talking about politics and the environment and the world. And I think I could never do what Margaret does. And Margaret's always saying, I could never do what you do. And that's just the way it is. We all live within our strengths.
And it's the way it ought to be. So Ann, my son is a college librarian. Let's hear it for Connecticut College.
Man, good for him.
He wanted to be, he in college studied, his major was philosophy and French. And, somebody asked him, what do you intend to do with that? Do you want to teach? And he said, no, he wasn't particularly interested in teaching. And he said, I just want to be around books. And I said, well, how about library science? So that's how he ended up doing that. But he once asked me, I was working on a novel and he asked me how that was going. And I said, I'm not sure I'm going to stick with it. And he said, why? And I said, I don't have all that much time left on this planet. And I'm thinking maybe it would be better spent reading great books than writing mediocre books. Now, this is not a problem that you seem to have, one great book after another. But I do want to talk to you about some influences, about other writers. You express in this book a deep appreciation of, among others, John Updike, Eudora Welty. But I want to talk to you about two other writers tonight, if we could, who seem to have inspired you greatly. And one is Kate DiCamillo. I'm going to get to her in a second. And the other is a comic strip beagle. And I thought maybe I could get you to talk a little bit about how it was that Snoopy inspired you.
It's such an interesting story. So I know this guy named Andrew Blauner, who's a literary agent, and he edits books. And he called me and he said he was doing an anthology of writers and illustrators writing about their favorite Peanuts characters. And would I write a piece for his anthology? And I said, no, I wouldn't really be interested in writing about Peanuts unless I could write about Snoopy, and you're not going to give me Snoopy. And he said, oh, yeah, I'll give you Snoopy. And my heart just stopped. I mean, I was so, so excited. Me? You're going to give me Snoopy? I can write about Snoopy? And I've loved Snoopy since I was a kid. And when I got the assignment, I went and got those giant Peanuts omnibus books, and I started reading the old strips. And what I realized in doing the reading was that literally every single thing I knew about writing came from Snoopy. When I was in graduate school, we still lived in the world of the SASE, the self-addressed stamped envelope. And if you wrote a story and you sent it to the Atlantic, you would put in your self-addressed stamped envelope, and then you would stand in front of your mailbox and wait for it to come back. And if your envelope came back, then you knew that they hadn't picked your story. But if you got a nice little thin white envelope, then they had picked your story. Okay, I knew about that because of Snoopy. I watched Snoopy get an agent. I watched him publish his first book. I watched the book go out of print because it only sold one copy. I watched him be remaindered. I watched him get bad reviews. And then he would realize, well, I just have to get back to work. He didn't get into the writer's colony, so he goes to work at his kitchen table. I had no idea until I started this project that all of my ideas, everything I knew about writing had been formed when I was a kid. And he just kept working on it, which more than anything is the secret to being a successful writer. You have to just be willing to get knocked off your doghouse time and time again, and then crawl back up there and get back to work.
Well, I love I love that you pay tribute to Snoopy as an influence in your life. I thought that was just great. So let's move on to Kate DiCamillo, who you discovered her work not all that long ago, and it was a recommendation from a friend. And you began reading and couldn't put those books down. So it takes me back to my conversation with my son about me telling him I don't have time to discover all of the great books and all of the great writers out there. Can you discuss a little bit what it was about reading Kate DiCamillo that was so thrilling for you? And do you ever worry, as I do, that there's so many? I mean, you didn't know about Kate DiCamillo. There are thousands of writers I don't know about and may not have the time to find out. Is that scary? But let's start with, what about her work did you find so thrilling?
Willingness to really dig into what's hard and brilliant about childhood. I kept reading her books thinking, children shouldn't read these. They're so scary and so hopeless, and then so hopeful all at the same time. And I thought, this is actually what it was like to be a child. What was terrifying to me about reading those books was that they really put me back into childhood. And we forget that kids are tough, and we forget that childhood is terrifying. And she really addresses those things. Her new book, which is called The Beatrice Prophecies, is about a little girl in some other time, be it in the past or the future, we don't know, in which girls are not allowed to read. And some monks discover a little girl. She doesn't remember where she came from, but she knows how to read. Well, the Beatrice prophecy that the monks keep, the prophecies, is that someday a girl child will be found who can read. And when they find her, this child will take over the kingdom. And so the king knows that a girl who can read has been found, and he sets out to try to find her and kill her. That's kind of terrifying. But it's also deeply moving when you think about women's rights and girls' rights and what's going on in our country right now. You talk about whether or not something is political, that actually winds up being a very, very strong and political book. And the writing is so gorgeous. When that book came out, I kept saying to people at the store, this is like the week that Charlotte's Web was published. This is a book, The Beatrice Prophecies, that people are going to be reading for generations after we're dead. She's just a brilliant writer. There's nobody like her. And she writes books for tiny children all the way up through middle grade. And the fact is, these books can be read by adults. And it's really a pleasure to read a novel that you can start and finish in 2 hours.
Well, for sure. So let me ask you, Anne, when you read something that inspires, like that obviously did, does it shake loose some ideas? Does it make you does it give you a better understanding of your writing and of untold stories and themes that you might want to pursue? Does reading great writers make you a better writer?
Boy, you're asking a couple of different questions. Does reading great writers make me a better writer? Yes, because it sets my sights higher always. And that's what I want to do. I want to be inspired. I want to be pushed. There are a lot of people that I read that I think, I could never do anything like this. I want to try harder, not to do something like this, but to just push myself more. Kate DiCamillo writing The Beatrice Prophecies. Elizabeth Strout has a new book out called Oh, William. And her books are so fine. They're just laser sharp. I feel like every single sentence is as spare and direct as is possible. And I think, what would it be like to write a book that was so succinct and deep and quiet? And then I read Colson Whitehead's Harlem Shuffle, which is like an ornate tapestry. Every sentence is a whole lifetime. There's so much in it. And you can't look away from the page for a second. It takes all of your concentration to read it. And it's so rewarding. It's a completely different experience, those three writers. So it's not like I'm thinking, oh, I want to be like Colson. I want to be like Liz. I want to be like Kate. I just always want to be better. And better writers remind me to be better.
Well, I sometimes find that when I'm reading great writers, that I get discouraged. I have actually thrown a book across the room because I thought, well, if that's what somebody else is doing, why am I bothering? And I got to tell you that your book got tossed around a little bit too. This one, and I'd read a line and think, okay, how does that exist? And I would look at a sentence and try to break it down. How are those 5, 6, or 7 words so powerful, and one of them stands on the page like a fist? How does she do that? And I'm wondering if that comes easily for you. I'm wondering if you're a big rewriter, and so give us a sense of. I taught a class at Cal State LA, and students would say, you give us these assignments and they're hard, but you're a professional writer and writing is easy for you. And I said, I don't know a writer for whom writing is easy, and I might write the first sentence of a column 10 times before I get it right, and then move on to the second one and write that one 10 times. And then I've got it perfect, except it doesn't go with the first one or set up the third. Are you a big rewriter?
I'm a big rewriter, but maybe not in the way that you think of rewriting. I rewrite a sentence, and boy, the beginning. I mean, I can write the first 10 pages of a novel 50 times. But for me, it's like digging a basement for a house. And I have to get the basement exactly right before I can go onto the first floor. I have to get the first floor exactly right before I can go onto the second floor. I don't understand how somebody can build a whole house and then say, I'm going to go back and work on the basement again. That's just not how I think. So I rewrite endlessly, but I, for the most part, really do it as I go along. And it's interesting. I want to say this was Stephen King's On Writing. And he talks a lot about rewriting. It's a fascinating book, and it's especially good in audio because he reads it. But he has all of these rules. You write, and then you put it away for 10 days and 12 hours, and then you take it out again and you read it and you do this much work, and then you give it to one person and you wait 3 weeks, and then he has real formulas for how you rewrite and rewrite. And he said, you've got to do it this way unless you're Kurt Vonnegut. And Kurt Vonnegut would just keep rewriting the same sentence over and over again until he went on to the next sentence. And in that sense, I'm much more in the camp of Kurt Vonnegut.
Did I catch you? Did I hear you correctly? How many times did you say you might rewrite the first page of a novel?
Oh, easily 50 times. Easily. But I'll tell you what, the last pages, not at all. Because I know what I'm doing then, because I have the voice in my head. I am a very weak starter, and I'm good in the middle, and I'm great at the end.
Do you ever do this? So you wrote it 50 times. Each time that you wrote it, you must have thought, okay, this is pretty good. Do you sometimes wake up the next day and what you thought was great yesterday now looks like the worst thing you'd ever written?
Hell yes. That's why you get up in the morning, to find out what you did yesterday is terrible.
I am so happy to hear that.
Yeah, and just moving words. I've published 2 children's books, and I've written a lot more. And those books are about 700 words. I also write op-eds. I'm very interested in word counts. And to bring that interest to a novel where I will look at a page at the beginning and say, how can I say this more succinctly? How can I say this more clearly? You were talking a minute ago about time. And I think that every writer that I know is obsessed with time. How time works in a book, in a story, in an essay, how time works in our own life, and how time works for the reader. And the way that I've changed as I've gotten older is when I was young, if I had an idea for a novel, that was enough. If I had an idea for a story, then it was your responsibility to read it. And now I'm 58 and I have such a sense of the value of time, of my time and of your time as a reader. And I don't want to give you anything that isn't worth your time. I don't want to give you anything that isn't my best work and that I feel like nothing is really new necessarily, but that I feel like, okay, I'm telling this in a way that's important.
Well, I think that I think that's just wonderfully put. Sometimes it helps to have a good editor to bounce ideas off of, and I want to talk to you about one of your trusted editors. In some ways, maybe your most trusted editor, and he happened to be a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department. Please talk to us. Please talk. And I love how one of your more recent manuscripts, he was quite ill, and you read to him, and he would respond by communicating, I think, not good, or yes, that's a good one. Tell us about your dad. Tell us about your dad. Tell us about his work, and tell us about why he worked as one of your sounding boards, one of your editors for so many years.
My dad was LAPD for 33 years, and he probably worked in every department of the police department in his career, but he was a great detective, which means he was a great researcher. There was nothing that I couldn't ask my dad that he just wasn't on it. He would go out looking for it, figuring out my problems for me. He was a great reader, beautiful grammar, perfect speller, was always somebody to say, oh, well, you know, you've repeated this, you could cut this back. So dad was a terrific editor and just a very, very smart man and a great reader. And I miss him a lot. It's funny though, because my father was also the morality police. He never wanted my characters to, he never wanted them to swear. He didn't want them to have sex. And he surely didn't want them to smoke, although he had smoked for most of his life. And it's funny, now that he's gone, I find that everybody is smoking. In the Dutch House, it is a novel of nonstop smoking. And really these precious days, the number of times it refers back to cigarettes is just astonishing, because now my dad isn't here to make me take all the cigarettes out.
Did he talk to you much about his work? Would he tell you about a case he was working on?
Not very often. Certainly, if I asked him questions, he would tell me. My father was very, very private. He had worked on a lot of famous cases. He was the person who connected the Tate and LaBianca murders. And he was one of the people who went out to the ranch and brought Manson and the Manson family in. He was the person who picked up Sirhan the night he shot Bobby Kennedy. And he would certainly tell me about those things if I asked. He would never talk to the press. My father used to say, there is everything to be lost and nothing to be gained by giving an interview, which I think about sometimes.
Well, I liked him. I liked him quite a bit before I heard that part of it. No, I understand where he's coming from. So I just finished a book. My editor, speaking of editors, is with is based in Nashville, HarperCollins. And in this book, it's about, I spent a year trying to figure out whether to retire. And I talked to people who had retired and regretted it, people who loved it, people who were thinking about it. And one of the people I went to for advice in my year of research was a guy by the name of Father Greg Boyle. And I asked
my
Father
hero.
Greg, I asked him about, did he think much about retiring? And he looked at me as if that was the oddest question he'd ever been asked. And he said his work gives him such meaning. He feels like, he feels like it's relevant, and it enriches him in so many ways. And he said he was gonna retire to the graveyard and not a day before he was called. Now, on page 42 of your book, I was surprised to see this. You said, I quote, "I urge you to read Gregory Boyle's Barking at the Choir, The Power of Radical Kinship, a book that shows what the platitudes of faith look like when they're put into action." And then I move on to the next essay in your book, These Precious Days, and it's The Worthless Servant, in which you write about travels with a Nashville priest and a family friend by the name of Charlie, who seems to have been inspired by a quote from Robert F. Kennedy. So what have you learned about people, about storytelling from the likes of Father Greg and Father Charlie?
Boy, I'll tell you what, there are no better storytellers than those two men. And one of the books that I cannot stop talking about is Greg's new book, The Whole Language, The Power of Radical Tenderness, because I think you want to talk about something that exists to balance out the news. How can I be a better person? How can I make this a better world? Things are so terrible. People are so polarized. What do we do? Read Greg Boyle's book, The Whole Language, and then you'll know what to do, which is just try to be a better person. Try to be helpful where you can. Try to stand with the people who need you to stand with them. I am so profoundly moved by his work and also by Charlie Strobel's work here in Nashville. Charlie's definitely a quieter guy, but they both get a lot of their point across by being good storytellers. And it just goes to show there is tremendous power in storytelling, and it's a great way to change the narrative. The narrative that we get so often is that we're all at each other's throats and the world is falling apart. But sometimes if you present a different narrative, which is people just need to be loved and understood. There's a line in that essay about Charlie in which he said to me, you just have to give some thought to the notion that maybe everybody didn't get a fair chance, that everything isn't fair. And it's like Greg saying, nobody is on the margin if you go and stand with that person.
Exactly. That is one of his more powerful lines. And he is such a great storyteller. And I think he's converted so many people who make a judgment about those who just don't make it. And he's there to listen, to give a second chance, to really understand and connect. In fact, when I'm over at talking to Father Greg, you have to go into a conversation with Father Greg knowing that it will be interrupted about 100 times, because every young man who comes through, he wants to reach out, connect, say something to him. He's an inspiration, and he's quite a treasure here in Los Angeles, as you know.
And let me just say, I just sent him a copy of my new book, and I signed it, but not to him. And I put a note on it saying, you don't strike me as the kind of man who holds on to your books. So I'm not going to put your name on it.
I think you understand him well. So let's talk about the title essay. What does it say? What does it say about you that you meet Tom Hanks and end up developing the closer relationship with his personal assistant? Tell us briefly how that happened. It begins, I guess, with Tom sending you a book looking for a blurb, and then him narrating a book. But then you meet Suki. So tell me a little bit about that. How
Yeah,
you
well,
got.
and certainly Tom didn't send me the book. His publisher sent me the book looking for a blurb, which I loved the book. It's called Uncommon Type. And then I was asked to go to DC to interview him on stage. I did. And while we were waiting backstage, his assistant, Suki Raphael, was there. And I was so interested in her. She was just, I can't even put my finger on it, but I kept thinking, I really want to know who you are, and I want to know what your story is. And we kept in touch a little bit after we met because Tom was interested in possibly opening a bookstore, and then he ended up narrating The Dutch House. And Suki and I stayed in touch because of those two things, maybe an email a month. And we talked a lot about color. She was a painter, and I was sending her books about painting and color theory and that sort of thing, because sending people books is how I communicate because I own a bookstore. And then I found out after the fact that she had had pancreatic cancer. She'd had a Whipple. She had chemo and radiation. She was pronounced cancer-free. And then she had a recurrence. And when she had the recurrence, she needed to find a clinical trial to get into really fast. And one night, my husband and I were out walking our dog, and my husband's a doctor. And I was telling him about this email that I had gotten from Suki. I don't think I'd ever mentioned Suki to him before because it was such a slight email correspondence. Carl said, have her send me her files if she'd like to. I'll see what I can do. He got her into a clinical trial here at the hospital where he works. UCLA was about to start the same clinical trial. So Suki was just going to come out here for 10 days, start the trial. Then UCLA was going to start the trial and she was going to go home. But what happened is the pandemic intervened in the meantime. And all over the country, clinical trials that hadn't begun were closed down because the hospitals needed to use all of their resources for COVID. And so she was shipwrecked here, basically. Plus, there were no flights. Plus, even if there had been flights, her white count was too low to get on a plane with a bunch of people who might have had COVID. So suddenly, my travel plans were all canceled. I was in the middle of a book tour. Carl was doing telemedicine from home, and Suki was downstairs painting because she'd always wanted to be a painter, but she never had any time. And now she realized that she had this time and she was not going to waste a second of it. And so the three of us spent very precious days, very, very precious days together, living together, three adults just stuck in a house. And we were so incredibly happy and so fortunate to be together.
You told that story with such elegant restraint and love, and I didn't know where it was going. And I love that about it. I couldn't put it down because I wondered where is this going? And I think that I will never go to the beach in Santa Monica without thinking about you and friends, taking your dear friend Suki down to the beach. It'll be a lasting memory for me. And that was
There we are in Malibu. Yeah.
Just a wonderful, wonderful story. We're getting close to wrapping this up, but so let me see if maybe this might be my final question. I could talk to you for another 60 minutes, but you don't need that. Can you tell us anything? Can you tell us anything about the novel that you have in progress right now?
I've written 12 pages of it. When I've been thinking about it for 3 years, so it's pretty darn clear in my head. And when I finish with all the publicity and the responsibilities for this book, probably the first of the year, I'll unplug the phone and lock the door and stay home and just work on it. It's about grown-up love, married love, And it's something that I've wanted to write for a long time. Hey, can I
It's
tell you
well,
something else can I tell you something else that's just completely
yes,
off
please
topic,
do.
but I want to say it because this is the LA Times. My
Yes.
grandfather, who my dad's dad, was the janitor at the LA Times. And my grandmother worked at the lunchroom. And that was back in the days when everything was ink and everything was filthy. Everybody's hands were covered in ink, all the paper, every floors, walls, sinks, everything was ink. And when my grandfather came to this country from England, my father had 7 kids, and my father was the first one to be born in Los Angeles. And my grandfather had a job at Columbia Studios as a machinist. He went out on strike. He lost his job, couldn't go back into the film industry, and spent the rest of his life working at the LA Times. So I have a great affection and connection to that paper.
Well, if you would like to follow in their footsteps, I think we can help out. We can be of assistance if you'd like to work with us at the LA Times. The building
Yeah,
is closed.
I would have
right
to
now.
follow. I would have to follow in the role of my family. I would have to be the janitor at the LA Times, which
Well,
would be okay because actually I'm sort of a cleaning fanatic.
I think we might be able to find something else for you. You know, I wish that I could ask Carl a bunch of questions. You say you're talking about adult relationships, about adult love. What
He's right here. If you ask me a question, I'll turn around and ask him.
ask him what he thought of this book and about your descriptions of his flying ability.
Carl, what did you think about?
And
just
Carl,
gave me
is it true,
up.
Carl, that you began flying when you were 10?
Is it true, Carl, that, yeah, let me tell you how true that is. Yes, it is true that he began flying when he was 10. But when I wrote that essay about Carl's flying, I published it first in the New Yorker. And I kept saying to him, they've got a fact checker at the New Yorker that will take this whole thing apart word by word. The New Yorker takes their facts in this post-fact world. The New Yorker takes their facts very, very seriously. And they made Carl come up with proof of every tail number, every date, every age of every plane. They drove him out of his mind. But yeah, Carl is a really, really good pilot. He's going to fly to Mississippi tomorrow to see his mom, who is going to be 100 in January. And yeah, he's the real deal.
Good for her. And did we see Sparky there briefly?
Yeah, you did. And yes, that was a picture of Carl and Sparky that just came up.
Oh,
Sparky,
there we go.
the famous shop dog. Yes.
And like I say, I could do this forever, but I think that Donna is going to have some questions that have come in. We wanted to leave some time for our readers and our viewers to offer up a question or two. If you're up for that, then I will turn it over to Donna right now.
Well, before you go, wait, Donna, before you go, I just want to say, Steve, half of what I do with my life is I interview people at the store. I interview authors constantly, and it is a ton of work, and it is a thankless job. And I know how much you put into this, and I just really, really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, that is very nice of you. I really, really appreciate that. And
well,
let's.
I really, really appreciate it. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Donna.
Around. We're going to ask him a few questions too. So thank you both. What a great conversation. And I have to say, I love that you talked about Father Greg. It was shortly before the pandemic. that we read Father Greg's book, Barking to the Choir, the LA Times Book Club. And my favorite part of it is that we took the book club to Homeboy Industries. So we had breakfast with Father Greg, and then our book club readers went in and saw firsthand what redemption looks like. We went into the bakery, we met everyone, and I just can't wait till the world opens up again so we can do more LA Times book clubs just out around LA where we take people. So thank you for both of you. That was wonderful. We actually invited Father Greg to come tonight as a special guest, but as you know, he was speaking at a gala, and he sent us regrets.
No doubt. I can't imagine getting on his calendar.
Very much in demand. Well, we do have quite a few reader questions, and we only have time for a few, but I'm going to get started here. So our first question comes from Robert in Laguna. And he says, have you ever started a book thinking you wanted one person to tell the tale, but abandoned the first draft and told it from another perspective? He is especially interested. He goes back to the Dutch house and he says, did you ever consider having Andrea's perspective, that she was really quite intimidated by those kids?
Yes, and that's a really, really good point, because people are always saying to me, oh, Andrea, she's so terrible. She's so horrible. And I'm like, yeah, but the person who's telling the story is the person who doesn't like her. So you have to remember, whenever you're reading a first person narration, you're only getting the point of view of that one person. I do often think very, very hard about who's going to tell the story. But once I start, I almost never change my mind. So I do that work ahead of time.
Next up is a question from Jerry. And he says, have you ever been to the Opera House in Manus? It's so beautifully described in State of Wonder that I felt like I'd been to Brazil.
Okay, so I'll tell you the truth. No, I have never been to the Opera House in Manaus. I had plans to go, and get this, I was going with Renee Fleming. This is actually hysterical. Wow. Renee Fleming and I were going to go to Manaus. She was going to sing at that opera house. And then at the last minute, her tour changed, and she called me and she said, oh, you know what? We're not going to do Manaus anymore. We're going to do Mexico City instead. Is that fine? I said, no, it's not fine. It's not helpful at all. And what I did was I watched Fitzcarraldo several times. And it opens in the Opera House at Manaus, and it was everything that I needed to know. So,
well, clearly, well, thank you so much. Okay, I'm just going to keep moving along here. This one comes from Susan Wolfson. And she says, I always appreciate your work and have observed a loving detachment in the personal essays that have appeared in the New Yorker and elsewhere. Could you speak about what you've done, if anything, to see past personal experience clearly with neither excessive rancor nor excessive sentimentality? How do you keep those out of your work?
Yeah. You know, that's funny, because that sort of compassionate detachment is something that I think about a lot in my life. I don't think about it in my writing, but I think that those essays are my life and they are my perspective. Part of it's just being old, you know, just growing up and knowing that if you become an emotional storm every time something happens, you really can't do any good for anyone. And actually, going back to Father Greg is a nice way of giving it perspective. He cares so deeply about the men and women that he works with, and he is so helpful to them. But he doesn't allow himself to be shredded personally, emotionally, by everyone who walks in the door. He funnels it into actually helping people. And so I aspire to do the same.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Barndy. And she wants to know, what made you decide to read the audio version yourself for the new book?
I got an email from Tom Hanks, and he was like, so the new one's narrated by a girl, basically. I'm not going to be able to do it. And I said, that's fine. I'm doing it. I read my own nonfiction. because I feel like I'm not a good enough actress to read my fiction. I don't do multiple voices and that sort of thing, but I'm a good reader. And if it's nonfiction and I basically am the person telling the story and not a character, then it makes sense for me to do it. Doesn't make sense for me to do the fiction.
Well, that's a great segue to our final question. It comes from a reader named Ricky, who also brought up Tom Hanks and says, you mentioned that Tom Hanks asked you about opening a bookstore. And she wonders, what advice did you give him?
The advice that I gave him, and he wound up not opening a bookstore, is to have a partner, because the partnership that I have with Karen Hayes is the thing that makes Parnassus Books work. She is the in-store owner manager, which means Karen and I made the decision to hire Karen to run the store. Karen gets a salary, I don't get a salary. But I think that if I was the owner of the bookstore and I hired Karen to run the bookstore, it wouldn't work. And so I said to Tom, find someone who wants to own and run a bookstore and partner with that person so that they are fully invested in the ownership of the store. So basically, when the water main breaks at 3:00 in the morning, they're not going to call you.
It sounds like wonderful advice. Well, now I have a question for both of you. We've been talking about writing through the pandemic, and we always like to ask our guest authors what they're reading. So I'm curious, do each of you have a book that helped you get through the pandemic that you found to be an escape? I'll start with Steve. Steve, did you find escape in a particular book that you would recommend to our book club audience?
I don't know that I would call it an escape. And I just completed writing a book. And when I'm writing a book, I often have trouble reading others because I'll just be reminded over and over again that I better step it up a little bit because the state of the art is, the bar is much higher than where I am. But I do want to mention one book that I have just finished, and it's called, let me hold it up right there. Can you see that? Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy, which unfortunately 120 years later is as relevant now as ever. And it's by, leave it to David Zucchino to find an untold story. He's been doing that as a journalist for almost 50 years, and I had the pleasure of working with him at the Philadelphia Inquirer and the LA Times. He's now working with the New York Times, but check that one out, which, by the way, is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize this year for nonfiction.
And before we go to Ann, I just want to ask you, what is the title of your new book and when does it come out?
Yeah. Steve?
Steve, are you still there?
Oh, I'm sorry. You were asking me that question.
Oh, yeah, that one was for you. I was curious, what is the title of your new book?
I do.
You told us about it. It was about retirement, but I was curious because I love The Soloist. It was one of really just an amazing book. And I was just curious, what's the title of your next book? When do we see it?
Thank you. I do have senior moments. That was not one of them, I don't think. The title is, I began writing it on July 4th with giving myself a 1-year deadline to interview a number of people who are retired, people who, and people still working, among them Mel Brooks and Norman Lear, well into their 90s and still working every day. And I wanted to go on this journey to figure out whether I was ready to retire or not. And it's called Independence Day because I started on July 4th and finished it a year later on July 4th. It's called Independence Day, What I Learned About When to Retire from Those Who Already Have and Those Who Never Will. And it'll be coming out in September next year.
Right, that sounds interesting. And I'll shift back to the original question for Ann. Is there a book? I know it sounds like you clearly, you're like us, you read a million books, but was there one book that you really felt that you just escaped through the pandemic and was just a sanctuary for you?
Yes, and I'll say that the people who came into the bookstore, or when the bookstore was closed, the people who were ordering through the bookstore, we had so many people say, I want a book that is smart and funny and isn't going to crush me at the end. That is such a small group of books. Smart, funny books that aren't devastating at the end. But there was a book called Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason that I loved, and I sold. Everybody who read that book said that was the book, that was the pandemic book that for some reason just worked for me. So many people had trouble reading during the pandemic. They had trouble concentrating and getting into a book. Sorrow and Bliss just had the right balance of sort of a salty and sweet. Also, another book by Lily King called Writers and Lovers was a book that, for whatever reason, during the pandemic, people just sort of relaxed and said, this is the book that works for me. And I felt the same way about it. Lily has a new book of short stories, 5 Tuesdays in Winter. See, I just can't stop selling books. It just came out a few weeks ago. And Steve, I'm excited about your new book. That sounds like something I really want to read. Carl really wants to read. And I hope you'll come to Parnassus when it comes out.
Oh, listen, I will be there. I will be there. Yeah, and like I said, my editor is there. It's kind of a book about if you really if your identity is tied to what you do, who are you after you're done with that? It's about finding purpose and relevance after you move on from one thing and try to find something else that gives you as much purpose. But thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I'd be happy to come
Great.
to Nashville.
Well, I have to mention that tonight's independent bookseller is Page's Bookstore in Manhattan Beach. And we have thank you for signing autographed books. We actually ran out of all the autographed books, but we still have books. The bookstore still has plenty on sale. There was such a demand for copies of these precious days. So thank you for sending those signed books in advance. I also just wanted to give a quick preview of our next month. Our January book club is January 25th, and we're going to be welcoming Stephanie Land. She's going to join us to talk about her bestseller Maid, which is now a popular Netflix series. And if you haven't already, please be sure to sign up for the book club newsletter. It's where you keep up with upcoming events. We're always talking about not only the books that we're reading, but we'll catch up with authors and events that so you may, now that you're a book club author, you're kind of a book club author for life. So we often in the newsletter catch up with whatever you're up to, and we invite you to share your stories and stay in touch. And then the other thing is we always ask our book club readers to tell us what we should read. We're looking at a new year, and we always send out a survey after every book club event, and we always ask people tell us what we should read next. And as we wrap up tonight, I wanted to give each of you a chance to just make a final comment, get the last word in. Steve, any final comments that you'd have like to share before we end?
Well, I would just like to thank Ann for her time and especially for this wonderful book. It's just been a pleasure chatting with you here tonight. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. We appreciate that support, and I'd like to remind everybody that good, honest journalism is more important now than ever. So please support your local newspaper.
Boy, that is a great, great message. And I absolutely agree with you. Support your local newspaper. Easy to do in Los Angeles when your local newspaper is the LA Times. That gives you a much better paper. And also, I would like to say, support your local independent bookstores and shop local in general. I was so moved during the pandemic to see that when we had our doors closed, people still ordered books from us, and they kept their small businesses alive all throughout our communities. And it really matters because that's where our tax base comes from. And our tax base is where our teachers and our firefighters and our police officers come from. And it's who we are. So shop local.
Well, thank you, Steve Lopez and Ann Patchett. What a delightful conversation. And I'm just so grateful for you both for sharing your time and many talents with us. And thank you to all of our readers, and good night.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Bye-bye.